For years, investigators believed they were hunting different men. One department called him the East Area Offender. Another would eventually call him the original Night Stalker. And before either of those names existed, there had been a burglar moving through neighborhoods in Visalia. At the time, nobody suspected the story would become far more serious. Detectives had discovered something they couldn't explain. The problem was that the evidence kept repeating. With every passing year, the clock only gave the offender more time. Until decades later, a single piece of forgotten evidence changed everything.
Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications.
In Visalia, investigators thought they were dealing with a burglar. What they didn't know was that the offender would eventually be connected to one of the most extensive criminal investigations in California history. Years later, investigators would identify a suspect with a law enforcement background. The reports described break-ins, stolen property, and someone moving through neighborhoods after dark. In the mid-1970s, the burglaries began attracting more attention as investigators noticed behavior that didn't fit the profile of a typical thief. Nobody reading those reports would have guessed they were looking at the beginning of a much larger story. The offender didn't always behave like a typical thief, and financial gain didn't appear to be the sole motivation behind many of the incidents. The entries felt deliberate, as though whoever was responsible had spent time planning them in advance. Some witness accounts described a shadow moving seamlessly through fences and backyards in the dead of night. Then the crimes stopped. Or at least that was the assumption. For a while, investigators believed the burglaries had simply ended. Then, reports from another part of California began attracting attention. These incidents involved an offender entering occupied homes, making the crimes appear fundamentally different. The incidents occurred in different jurisdictions, involved different victims, and were categorized under different types of crimes. What made the situation more complicated? In several cases, investigators found indications that the offender may have spent time observing neighborhoods beforehand. Window screens, carefully pried open, days before the break-in, and rearranged furniture near the entry points. The signs suggested he had studied the properties beforehand. None of those observations proved the cases were connected. Some investigators considered the possibility that different criminals were simply imitating the methods. This theory seemed reasonable, until investigators realized some of the similarities appeared before those details had ever been released publicly. On their own, they were not enough to justify combining separate investigations. Why didn't police simply compare notes? But the late 1970s was not the modern world. A detective in Sacramento could spend months building a case file without ever seeing a report from another county, not because the information was classified. It simply never reached his desk. Information was stored locally and rarely moved beyond the agency that collected it. Reports that never arrived simply remained invisible. The barrier wasn't distance. It was the fact that most investigators only saw a small piece of the larger picture. And when you only see one piece of a puzzle, the wrong explanation can feel completely reasonable. Different agencies interpreted the evidence through completely different lenses. Some believed they were dealing with a serial burglar. Others believed they were facing something far more dangerous. The difficulty was that similar behavior kept appearing in places where investigators believed no local connection existed. Those cases did not look the same. They did not feel the same, which made the possibility that they might involve the same person much harder to accept. By the time similarities started appearing, separate teams had already spent years building different theories. And once a theory survives for years, investigators naturally begin looking for evidence that supports it. The harder part was finding a reason to challenge it. The next problem was harder to solve. It wasn't evidence, it was geography. And if you had seen the map at the time, you probably would have doubted the connection too. The crimes did not appear to move in a straight line. Incidents surfaced in different regions, separated by both distance and time. One cluster appeared here, another appeared hundreds of miles away. Then another surfaced somewhere else entirely. Investigators weren't looking at a line, they were looking at fragments. Some locations appeared connected. Others seemed far too distant to belong to the same offender. Most investigators had seen offenders stay close to familiar areas before. That expectation made sense. The theory created practical problems. The farther the incidents spread across the map, the harder they became to explain. A single offender seemed difficult to explain. Multiple offenders created a different set of questions. Faced with those choices, many investigators considered separate offenders the safer conclusion. Over time, investigators began noticing recurring details that had appeared in multiple case files over the years. At first, those similarities were easy to dismiss. Most experienced investigators had seen coincidences before. The reports did not stand out when they were written. Most were filed and forgotten. Some victims reported feeling watched for days before an incident. Others recalled unusual activity in their neighborhoods that seemed insignificant at the time. Years later, when investigators revisited those accounts, an uncomfortable reality emerged. The exact same anomalies kept surfacing in places they had no business being. An individual report rarely changed an investigation. Even several similar reports could still be dismissed as coincidence. But detectives eventually found themselves reading accounts from different cities that described remarkably similar experiences. The similarities were becoming difficult to dismiss, not because there was one overwhelming clue, but because those tiny, haunting details simply refused to fade away. Investigators could see echoes of the same behavior. What they couldn't determine was whether those echoes came from the same person. People reported unfamiliar vehicles lingering in neighborhoods. Others recalled strange phone calls or unexplained activity around their homes before an incident occurred. Taken individually, none of those reports seemed remarkable. The question was whether investigators were looking at isolated incidents or fragments of a larger pattern they still couldn't see. Only years later, when investigators began placing those reports side by side, did a difficult possibility begin to emerge. Nobody agreed on the answer. That uncertainty became one of the biggest obstacles in the entire investigation. What made them difficult to ignore was how often they appeared in places that investigators believed had no connection to one another. The reports still weren't proof, but the similarities refused to disappear. Over time, the names began doing more than organizing evidence. They shaped expectations. A detective searching for the East Area offender was looking for one kind of profile. A detective investigating the original Night Stalker was looking for another. The longer those identities remained separate, the easier it became to believe they belonged to different people. In some cases, the challenge isn't finding new evidence. It's recognizing that evidence collected years apart may belong to the same story. Some investigators later noted that the offender appeared unusually patient. Rather than acting impulsively, He seemed willing to spend time learning routines, studying neighborhoods, and waiting for opportunities. To some investigators, that suggested a recurring offender. Others remained unconvinced. The similarities were there. What remained missing was proof. Years later, investigators would finally identify a suspect. The revelation shocked many people. The man at the center of the investigation had once worn a police badge. The most unsettling part of this case may not be the offender himself. It may be how long the pieces remained separated. The Golden State Killer case is often remembered because investigators eventually identified a suspect. But the investigation revealed something uncomfortable about the way people process information. And if you had been working those cases at the time, there's no guarantee you would have seen the connection either. Once those categories took hold, every new piece of information was interpreted through them. If investigators spent decades treating those incidents as separate stories, how many other patterns remain invisible simply because no one has realized they belong together yet? Don't miss out on the next content. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications.